The winter of 1900 brought an unusual chill to the royal courts of Europe, but in Munich, something warmed the frost-laden air. A 24-year-old Belgian prince stood transfixed as a 17-year-old Bavarian duchess entered the room. Albert of Belgium, tall and serious with penetrating eyes, found himself captivated not by jewels or courtly grace, but by the sight of Elisabeth playing violin with an intensity that seemed to set her soul ablaze. She was different from every princess he had ever encountered, her fingers dancing across strings with the passion of a true artist rather than the polite accomplishment of nobility. Their meeting was orchestrated by families hoping for strategic alliance. Yet what unfolded was entirely unexpected. While other royals engaged in superficial pleasantries, Albert and Elisabeth discovered they spoke the same language, a language of curiosity, compassion, and quiet rebellion against the gilded cage of aristocratic life. Elisabeth, daughter of Duke Karl Theodor of Bavaria, had been raised in an unconventional household where her father, a renowned ophthalmologist, performed surgeries for the poor and encouraged his children to pursue genuine passions rather than mere appearances. Albert was equally unconventional for a prince, reserved and intellectual. He had spent his youth climbing mountains, studying engineering, and wrestling with the weight of knowing he might one day wear a crown he never sought. His older brother Baudouin had been groomed for kingship, leaving Albert free to pursue his interests in science and exploration. But fate has a cruel sense of irony. Just months before meeting Elisabeth, Baudouin had died suddenly, and Albert found himself thrust into the position of heir to the Belgian throne, a role he accepted with duty but not desire. Their courtship unfolded through letters, hundreds of them, written in French and German, crossing borders with the regularity of heartbeats. In an age when royal marriages were transactions negotiated between states, Albert and Elisabeth dared to fall genuinely in love. He wrote to her of his fears about kingship, his passion for mountaineering, his dreams of a Belgium that served its people rather than merely ruling them. She responded with equal candor, sharing her musical compositions, her philosophical questions, her own anxieties about losing herself in the rigid protocols of royal life. One letter from Albert, written in the spring of 1901, reveals the depth of their connection. He described climbing alone in the Alps, reaching a summit at dawn, and feeling both the magnificent isolation of the peak and an overwhelming desire to share that moment with her. He wrote that he had never believed one person could be both companion and soulmate until he met her, that she made him want to be worthy not just of a crown, but of her respect and love. Elisabeth's reply came 3 weeks later. She confessed that she had composed a violin piece during his absence, each note an attempt to capture what his letters made her feel, the soaring hope and the tender vulnerability of allowing someone to truly see her. She told him she did not want to be his queen. She wanted to be his partner, his confidant, the one person before whom he need never perform. They married on October 2nd, 1900, in Munich, and then again in a Belgian ceremony in Brussels. The crowds that gathered were curious about this Bavarian duchess with the serious eyes and artistic soul. Would she adapt to Belgian life? Could a woman who preferred violin practice to state dinners, who spoke her mind with unsettling directness, survive the suffocating expectations of queenship? The answer came gradually, as Elisabeth defied predictions. She learned Flemish and French with determination, understanding that Belgium's linguistic divide was a wound that needed healing, not exploiting. She established music schools and supported artists, not as patronizing charity, but as genuine investment in culture. She studied medicine, actually studied it, attending lectures and learning surgical techniques from her father, then using that knowledge to work as a nurse, much to the horror of traditionalists who believe queens should distribute alms, not dress wounds. But their true test was still years away. For now, they had what few royal couples ever experienced: genuine partnership and mutual respect. Albert relied on Elisabeth's counsel on matters of state, finding her political instincts often sharper than those of his advisors. She challenged him, questioned him, refused to be merely decorative. Their evenings often ended with fierce debates about social reform, workers' rights, the responsibilities of monarchy in a changing world. They had 3 children, Leopold, Charles, and Marie-José, and Elizabeth approached motherhood with the same unconventional intensity she brought to everything. She nursed them herself, shocking the court. She insisted they learn practical skills alongside royal duties. She wanted them prepared for useful lives, not merely ornamental ones. Then came 1909, and everything changed. Albert's uncle, King Leopold II, died, and Albert ascended to the throne he had never wanted. At 34, he became King Albert I of Belgium, and Elizabeth became queen. The weight of the crown pressed down immediately, but they faced it together, 2 people who had promised to be partners now tested by the ultimate challenge of sovereignty. Albert proved an unusual king. He was accessible, often walking Brussels streets and speaking with ordinary citizens. He visited factories and mines, genuinely listening to workers' grievances. He pushed for social reforms, expanded voting rights, improved labor conditions. Elizabeth matched him stride for stride, expanding her nursing work, championing education, using her position to amplify causes rather than merely lending her name to them. But personal happiness and domestic reform are luxuries history does not always permit. In the summer of 1914, storm clouds gathered across Europe. Alliances, arms races, and ancient hatreds created a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came on June 28th when Archdial Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. Within weeks, Europe began its descent into catastrophic war. Belgium's position was precarious. A small nation wedged between great powers, its neutrality guaranteed by treaty, but vulnerable to geography. When Germany demanded passage through Belgium to attack France, Albert faced the decision that would define his reign. He could acquiesce, allow German armies to march through Belgian territory, preserve his nation's infrastructure, and spare his people the horrors of war. His military advisors knew Belgium's small army could not stop the German war machine. Resistance seemed futile, a gesture that would bring destruction without preventing invasion. Albert called his council on August 2, 1914. In that room, with ministers and generals arrayed before him, he made his choice. Belgium would resist. Treaties meant something. Neutrality meant something. If Belgium surrendered its principles to preserve its buildings, what would remain worth preserving? His voice was quiet but absolute. Belgium would fight. He did not make this choice lightly or alone. The night before, he had walked the palace gardens with Elisabeth until dawn. They spoke of their children, of the people they had come to love, of the ruins that resistance would bring. Elisabeth never wavered. She told him that some choices are about who you are, not what you gain. That their marriage had been built on the belief that integrity matters more than comfort. That if they surrendered now, everything they had tried to build, a monarchy of service, a nation of dignity, would be revealed as beautiful lies. On August 4th, German armies crossed into Belgium. What followed was predictable, yet horrifying. The Belgian army fought with desperate courage, but was overwhelmed. German forces, frustrated by unexpected resistance, retaliated with brutal ferocity. Towns were burned, civilians executed, cultural treasures destroyed. The world watched in shock as Germany violated Belgian neutrality and committed atrocities that turned public opinion, especially in Britain and the United States, decisively against the Central Powers. Albert made another unconventional choice. He refused to flee to safety or govern from exile. Instead, he took personal command of the Belgian army, becoming the only European monarch to lead his forces in combat throughout the war. He was not performing monarchy, he was living it. In trenches and command posts, wearing a soldier's uniform, sharing the mud and danger and exhaustion of his troops, he became something more than a king. He became a symbol of resistance, of small nations refusing to be erased by larger ones. And Elisabeth? She could have retreated to safety, to neutral Switzerland or allied France. Instead, she established herself behind Belgian lines, transforming herself into a battlefield nurse. This was not ceremonial. She worked in hospitals overwhelmed with wounded, performing surgeries, amputating limbs, holding dying soldiers as they breathed their last. Her medical training, once considered an eccentric royal hobby, became desperately practical. Their letters from this period are heartbreaking. Gone are the philosophical musings and tender endearments of their courtship. These are letters written in stolen moments between battles and surgeries, on scraps of paper, in handwriting shaken by exhaustion. Albert wrote to her of the unbearable responsibility of ordering men to their deaths, of walking through field hospitals and seeing boys barely old enough to shave destroyed by shells and gas. He wrote that only her letters kept him human, reminded him what they were fighting to preserve. Elisabeth wrote to him of holding 19-year-old soldiers as they died, calling for their mothers, of the smell of gangrene and the sound of men screaming through amputations when morphine ran short. She wrote that she played her violin in the evenings when she could, that music was the only thing that could still reach the part of her soul not calcified by horror. She told him she understood now why he could not leave his soldiers, that she could not leave hers either. For 4 years, they endured this separately together. Belgium was reduced to a tiny strip of territory, most of the nation occupied, its people suffering under brutal German rule. Albert commanded a small army, supplemented by French and British forces, fighting to hold that last fragment of free Belgian soil. The Western Front became a grinding hell of trench warfare, where men died by thousands for gains measured in meters. Through it all, Albert and Elisabeth maintained a correspondence that sustained them both. These letters were not meant for history. They were intimate, raw, and honest. Albert confessed moments of despair, times when he wanted to simply surrender to stop the dying. Elisabeth confessed that she sometimes could not remember what peacetime felt like, that she feared they had both been permanently broken by what they had witnessed. But they also reminded each other why resistance mattered. In one letter from 1916, Elisabeth wrote about a young soldier she had treated, a violinist who had lost his right hand. She helped him learn to play left-handed, spent weeks working with him. She wrote to Albert that this was why they endured, not for abstract principles, but for the possibility that this young man might one day play music again, that beauty and art and human dignity might survive the war. Albert's reply came 3 weeks later. He had carried her letter in his pocket, reading it before every decision, every order that would cost lives. He wrote that she was his conscience, his reminder that they were fighting for a world worth living in, not merely for survival. He told her that when the war ended, if they both survived, he wanted to spend their first peacetime evening in silence, just sitting together, remembering what peace felt like. The war ground on. The Battle of Passchendaele turned Belgian fields into drowning mud that swallowed men whole. Poison gas drifted across trenches, burning lungs and blinding eyes. The 1918 spring offensive brought German armies within striking distance of Paris, and for weeks it seemed the Allied cause might collapse entirely. But it did not. In the summer and fall of 1918, the tide turned. Fresh American troops poured into France, German supply lines faltered, and the great offensives finally stalled. On November 11th, 1918, the guns fell silent. After 4 years and millions dead, the Great War ended. Albert led Belgian forces back into Brussels on November 22nd, 1918. The crowds that greeted him were delirious with joy and grief. Nearly every family had lost someone. The nation's infrastructure was shattered, its economy destroyed, its people traumatized. But Belgium had survived, and more than survived, it had resisted. The small nation that dared defy Germany had become a powerful symbol of courage and principle. Elisabeth returned to a country desperately needing healing. She threw herself into reconstruction, establishing hospitals and schools, working to restore what war had destroyed. But the war had changed her. She was quieter now, more somber. Friends noticed she sometimes stopped mid-conversation, her eyes distant, seeing things they could not. Albert, too, bore invisible wounds. He had commanded armies, made decisions that sent thousands to their deaths. Victory brought no absolution for that weight. He became even more reclusive, finding solace only in mountaineering, climbing alone in the Alps, seeking in physical exertion some release from psychological burden. Their letters from the post-war years reveal two people struggling to find themselves again. They had been forged in crisis, their marriage tested by separation and horror. Now, they had to learn to be together in peace, carrying the scars of what they had endured. It was not always easy. Albert sometimes retreated into silence for days. Elisabeth threw herself into work with an intensity that worried those around her. But they had something many couples lack, a foundation built on genuine partnership and tested by ultimate crisis. They knew each other completely, had seen each other at their best and worst. That knowledge became their anchor. Slowly, they began to rebuild not just Belgium, but their own lives. Albert continued his unconventional kingship. He championed reconciliation between Belgium's Flemish and Walloon communities, pushed for economic modernization, and maintained Belgium's commitment to international cooperation, supporting the League of Nations despite its ultimate weakness. He remained accessible, continuing his habit of walking among his subjects, listening to their concerns. Elisabeth expanded her cultural and medical work. She established music conservatories, supported young artists, continued her nursing and medical education. She became known as a queen who actually did things rather than merely presiding over them. Her wartime service had earned her a respect that no amount of ceremonial appearances could have achieved. They grew older together, their partnership deepening into something rare and precious. In 1930, they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary. At the state dinner, Albert raised his glass and said simply that Elisabeth had been his companion in war and peace, his conscience and his comfort, and that everything good he had accomplished bore her fingerprints. But their story was approaching its final, tragic chapter. Albert never abandoned his love of mountaineering. Even in his late 50s, he continued climbing, finding in those solitary ascents something essential to his nature. Elisabeth worried but understood. They had always given each other space to be themselves. On February 17, 1934, Albert went climbing alone at Marc les Dames, a rock face he had climbed many times. He was 61 years old, but still strong and experienced. That evening, when he failed to return, search parties were organized. They found him at the base of the cliff, killed instantly in a fall. The exact cause was never determined. Perhaps a handhold crumbled, perhaps a moment's inattention, perhaps simply the risks inherent in climbing alone. Elisabeth received the news at the palace. She was 61, and in an instant, her partner of 34 years was gone. Not lost to war or illness or any of the dangers they had survived together, but to the mountains he loved, doing what he had always done. Friends later said she showed no emotion when told, simply nodded and asked to be left alone. She lived another 3 decades, dying in 1965 at 93. In those years, she continued her work, became a patron of sciences and arts, and maintained her reputation for directness and unconventionality. She never remarried, never even considered it. When asked once why not, she supposedly replied that she had already experienced a true partnership, that anything else would be pale imitation. Among her possessions when she died were boxes of letters, hundreds of them, spanning from courtship through war through peacetime. Their children donated many to Belgian archives, though some remained private, too intimate for public viewing. Those that were published reveal a love story unlike the typical royal romance. There are no flowery declarations or courtly conventions. Instead, there is honesty, partnership, two people who chose each other and continued choosing each other through circumstances that would have shattered weaker bonds. Albert and Elisabeth's legacy extends beyond their personal story. They redefined what monarchy could mean in the modern era, transformed it from distant pageantry to engaged service. Albert's decision to resist German invasion, made in consultation with Elisabeth, influenced history. Belgian resistance delayed German advance, bought time for French and British mobilization, and provided the moral clarity that brought Britain into the war. Without that resistance, the entire course of the First World War might have differed. But perhaps their truest legacy is the proof that even in the suffocating constraints of royal life, genuine love and partnership are possible. They were not perfect people. Albert could be withdrawn and moody. Elizabeth could be stubborn and tactless. But they were real with each other, honest about their flaws and fears, committed to supporting each other's growth and integrity. In an era when royal marriages were typically strategic arrangements where couples remained strangers wearing crowns, Albert and Elizabeth built something authentic. They wrote to each other constantly because they genuinely wanted to share their thoughts and experiences. They consulted each other on decisions because they truly valued each other's perspective. They endured separation during war because they both believed in something larger than personal comfort. Their letters, those intimate documents of a marriage tested by history's worst, reveal a simple truth. Real love is not about grand gestures or perfect harmony. It is about showing up, being honest, supporting your partner through doubt and crisis, and choosing each other again and again despite everything. It is about being seen completely and choosing to stay. In the end, the story of King Albert and Queen Elizabeth is not primarily about royalty or war or politics. It is about two people who found each other in a world designed to keep them apart, who built a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection, who faced together challenges that would have destroyed lesser bonds, and who left behind not just a legacy of service, but hundreds of letters testifying to what love looks like when it is real, tested, and true.